everybody, I am Pastor Katie, and this month we are talking about a special command given to followers of Jesus in the Bible, and this is to walk humbly with our God. Now, last week we started talking about pride versus humility, and just as a recap, we learned that pride is a deep feeling or pleasure or satisfaction which comes from your own achievements or possessions or qualities. You think a lot of yourself. Humility, on the other hand, is to think less of yourself and higher of others. Humility is making other people's needs and feelings more important than your own. So last week we talked about how being humble means you aren't concerned with appearances or power or belongings, and we focused on Jesus calling out the Pharisees, who weren't really concerned with demonstrating how God has called us to live, but were more concerned with the importance they felt from having a special position. This week we are talking about another godly characteristic of humility, and it's this: humble people are quick to ask for forgiveness and to give forgiveness. And we've got a great story to go along with it. So today in scripture we are reading Luke 23:32 through 43. Two other men, both criminals, were also led out with him to be executed. When they came to the place called the Skull, they crucified him there, along with the criminals, one on his right and the other on his left. Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." And they divided up his clothes by casting lots. The people stood watching, and the rulers even sneered at him. They said, "He saved others. Let him save himself if he is God's Messiah, the chosen one." The soldiers also came up and they mocked him. They offered him wine and vinegar and said, "If you are the king of the Jews, save yourself." There was a written notice above him which read, "This is the King of the Jews." One of the criminals who hung there hurled insults at him. "Aren't you the Messiah? Save us and yourself." But the other criminal rebuked him. "Don't you fear God," he said, "since you are under the same sentence? We are punished justly, for we are getting what our deeds deserve. But this man has done nothing wrong." And then he said, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." And Jesus answered him, "Truly, I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise." All right, so let's take a minute to see what's happening here. This is the day we celebrate all the time, right? Especially on Easter. It's the day when Jesus was crucified on the cross, which is sad, but we can rejoice and be glad because we know that 3 days later, he rose from the grave and stole the power of the grave and sin. But that part isn't what we're focusing on today. We're focusing on the little chat Jesus had with the men who were also being crucified. This is what you have to remember. Jesus was innocent, but he was condemned to die a sinner's death. A sinner, a breaker of the law, an evil man. That was a sinner. The two men who were hanging beside Jesus, they deserved what they were getting, unlike Jesus. Jesus, in all the pain that he physically was in, he was being taunted, sneered at, laughed at by the people he was dying for. He turns to heaven and he doesn't say, "God, give them what they deserve," or "God, they aren't worth this. God, let me down so I can teach them a lesson." All of the things we would probably want to say in his position. But instead he does this, the ultimate act of humility. He asked God to forgive them. He wasn't concerned about the injustice he was suffering or the pain he was suffering. He was concerned about others. Knowing that they were wrong, he asked God to forgive them. He pleaded for them. Now this is so beautiful because who witnesses this but one of the criminals hanging next to him? Now the other criminal, let's call him Larry, taunted Jesus, but the other, let's call him Fred, rebuked him, saying, "Do you not fear God? You and I are getting exactly what we deserve, but this man is innocent." And then he turns to Jesus and he says, "Will you remember me in your kingdom?" You see, Jesus set an example of humility, of offering forgiveness to those who didn't deserve it. He offered it freely because he valued them. And that's amazing grace, that he died for us who were still sinners. And the criminal, Fred, who saw this grace, this humility, this man who would put others ahead of himself, knew Jesus was who he said he was. And he admitted his own sin, that he was getting a punishment that he deserved. But he knew if Jesus was big enough, loving enough, gracious enough to forgive the men around him, then surely Jesus could forgive a sinner like him. He humbled himself by admitting his wrong. He didn't make excuses for his wrongdoing. That would be prideful. He simply admitted he was wrong and asked if Jesus could still love him despite his sin. And Jesus, being the mighty Redeemer he is, he said, "Today you will be with me in paradise." Boys and girls, Jesus set an example of being humble. He didn't kick and scream when he was being mistreated. He actually asked for forgiveness on the behalf of those who wronged him. He calls us to walk in humility like he did, not making excuses when we are wrong, but to ask for forgiveness quickly because we know we aren't perfect. And to remember that others aren't perfect either. But if Jesus was perfect and he forgave sinners, murderers, people who murdered him, can't we, who are also sinners and imperfect people, be quick to forgive others who are the same? Something to think about. I love you, boys and girls. I can't wait for week 3 of our Walk Humbly series. And I pray that this message ministers to you, that you take it to heart, and that you ask God for the grace to forgive others quickly and to ask for forgiveness quickly. I love you, and I'll see you next week.